I installed a security camera in the backyard. When the technician reviewed the footage, he whispered, "The more his hands shake, the easier this gets." That was the voice of my son-in-law and the daughter I loved most, plotting to strip me of everything right inside this very house. My ears rang, my heart clenched at the ruthless betrayal of my own family. But I didn't scream. I stayed quiet, backed away, and silently set a trap. They think I'm losing my mind, but the real hunt has just begun. Welcome to Dad Family Revenge. I'm incredibly grateful you're here today. To help our community grow, please comment below with your city or country. Also note, this story contains dramatized elements for entertainment and education. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is coincidental, but the life lesson I'm sharing is vital. I've been told I'm a practical man. 31 years of running Calloway Building Supply will do that to you when your livelihood depends on accurate inventory and honest numbers. You stop having much patience for anything that doesn't add up. Carol used to say, "I trusted receipts more than I trusted people," and she wasn't entirely wrong. What she never said, though she probably should have, was that the one exception to that rule was always family. Cedar Falls in late September has a particular kind of light. Not the heavy gold of midsummer, but something cooler and thinner, the kind that comes through kitchen windows at 4 in the afternoon and makes everything look a little more fragile than it did in July. I noticed it that Sunday, the way I'd been noticing small things since Carol passed. 5 years of living alone teaches you to pay attention to the details you used to overlook because someone else was filling the room. I'd sold the store 3 years earlier in 2021. The offer came at the right time. My knees had started complaining about the concrete floors, and the kind of focus it takes to run a business was getting harder to maintain without Carol there to talk things through with at the end of the day. The sale closed at $1.4 million, which was more than I'd ever expected when I opened the doors back in 1990 with a $12,000 loan and one commercial account. I paid off the house on Birchwood Lane in 2018. Between the sale proceeds and my retirement accounts, I was for the first time in my life what you might call comfortable. Not wealthy, comfortable. The house was worth around $340,000, according to the last appraisal. 3 bedrooms, a good-sized yard that Carol had spent 20 years turning into something worth looking at, and a back patio where we used to sit on summer evenings with iced tea and not say much. I hadn't changed much since she died. The garden still had her roses. The kitchen still had her yellow curtains. I liked it that way. Diane arrived at 2:30 with Greg and Sophie, same as most Sundays. Sophie was 8 years old that fall, all energy and questions, and she hit the back door at a full run the way she always did, wrapping both arms around my waist before I'd even gotten the screen door fully open. That part never got old. Diane hugged me at the door, asked if I'd eaten lunch I had, and started rearranging things in my refrigerator, the way she sometimes did, quietly, like she was just tidying up. Greg came in behind her with a bottle of sparkling water and a smile that had never given me any reason to question it. We had a good afternoon. Sophie showed me a drawing she'd been working on at school, something with horses and mountains that she narrated in considerable detail. Greg grilled burgers in the backyard while Diane and I sat at the patio table. The weather held. The conversation was easy. It was toward the end of the afternoon as the lights started going orange over the fence line when Greg brought it up. He'd heard about a break-in 2 streets over the Kellerman place on Sycamore, apparently. Someone had come in through an unlocked garage door late on a Wednesday night and made off with some tools and a bicycle. Nobody was home, nobody got hurt, but it had been the talk of the neighborhood for the past week. "Dad," Greg said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "I've been thinking about this for a while. You're out here by yourself. End of the block, the Pattersons next door are snowbirds half the year. If something happened, how long before anyone would even know?" I told him I appreciated the concern, but that I'd been taking care of myself for 65 years and didn't see any reason to stop. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. I know. I'm not trying to suggest you can't handle things. I just want to put up a few cameras. Front door, backyard, the side entrance. Nothing complicated. I'll pay for it. I'll handle the setup. You won't have to do anything. Diane reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Please, Dad. Just for us. So we can stop worrying. I looked across the yard at Sophie, who had abandoned the patio and was now lying on her stomach in the grass examining something near Carol's rose beds with the focused intensity that only children and scientists bring to the world. I thought about Carol, who had believed that accepting help gracefully was its own kind of strength. I thought about how empty the house felt on Wednesday nights when the street outside went quiet. All right, I said, if it'll give you peace of mind. Greg smiled. It was a good smile, warm, relieved, the kind a man gives when something he's been hoping for finally works out. At the time, I read it as gratitude. I know now it was something else entirely. The crew Greg hired showed up that Saturday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. 3 men in a white van with a magnetic sign on the door that said Cedar Valley Security Solutions. They were efficient and quiet, the kind of workers who move through a space without making it feel invaded, and by the time I'd finished my second cup of coffee, they had equipment laid out across my kitchen table like a surgeon's tools before an operation. Greg arrived 20 minutes after them. He walked in without knocking. He'd had a spare key for emergencies, since Carol got sick back when Diane needed to get in and out on short notice, and went straight to work alongside the crew like he'd been briefed beforehand, which I realized he probably had. Morning, Dad. He clapped me on the shoulder. This won't take long. 4 cameras, 1 DVR unit that's the recording box, and a motion sensor on the side door. By noon, you'll be all set. You seem like you've done this before, I said. He grinned. I watched about 6 hours of YouTube tutorials. Diane says I'm obsessed. I just want to make sure it's right. I poured him a coffee and stayed out of the way while they worked. The lead technician, a heavy-set man named Dale with a measuring tape clipped to his belt, walked the perimeter of the house, first taking notes on a clipboard. Greg followed him, and I noticed he had opinions about every placement. The front camera needed a wider angle to cover the driveway. The backyard camera should be mounted higher on the eave, not the fence post. The side entrance camera, the one covering the door off the kitchen, needed to face slightly left to capture the path from the street. He knew exactly what he wanted. I told myself that was because he'd watched 6 hours of tutorials. Diane came by around 10:30 with sandwiches and lemonade, kissing me on the cheek and squeezing my arm the way she did when she was pleased about something. "Doesn't it feel better already?" she asked, looking around the kitchen, like the cameras were already solving problems. "Ask me once they catch a raccoon on the back patio," I told her. She laughed. "Oh, Dad." The one moment that nagged at me, and I mean nagged, the way a loose thread nags something you notice and almost pull and then decide isn't worth the trouble, was when Dale and Greg were positioning the camera that covered my home office. That room had nothing particularly valuable in it. File cabinets, an old desktop computer, 30 years of business records. I kept mostly for sentimental reasons. Greg stood in the doorway longer than he needed to, tilting his head left and right, asking Dale to adjust the angle twice. "You want full coverage in there?" Dale asked. "It's an interior hallway mount. You'd usually just do the entry points." "Dad keeps important documents in there," Greg said, not looking at me. "Just want to make sure it's covered." I thought that was considerate of him. I thought a lot of things that morning that I later had to revise entirely. By 11:45, it was done. Dale walked me through the setup. The DVR unit sat in a cabinet under the TV in the living room, a black box about the size of a hardcover book, blinking a small green light to show it was recording. 4 camera feeds appeared on a split screen on the TV, and the same feeds showed up on a phone app. Dale handed me a printed instruction sheet. I looked at it and felt the particular kind of overwhelm that comes from technology designed by people 40 years younger than you. "I'll be honest," I said, "I'm not going to remember half of this. That's what I'm here for," Greg said, already taking the phone from my hand, with the comfortable ease of someone who'd done it 100 times. "I'll set up the admin account on my phone too so I can monitor alerts and do any updates remotely. That way you don't have to worry about the technical side at all. If anything looks off, I'll catch it." I nodded. It made sense. I'd spent 30 years letting my store manager handle the computer inventory because some things are better left to people who don't have to think hard about them. This was the same principle. "Just one thing, Dad." Greg looked up from the phone, his expression easy and open. "Don't unplug the DVR or try to reset it yourself. It can corrupt the footage. If anything seems wrong with the system, just call me and I'll sort it out." "Understood." Diane touched my arm. "Don't you feel better?" I looked at the 4 small camera feeds on the TV screen. My front porch, my driveway, my back patio, the side entrance off the kitchen, and I felt something I could only describe as reassurance. The house felt watched over, safe. That evening, after they'd all gone home, I sat in the living room with the lights low and watched the 4 feeds for a while. The rose beds moved slightly in the wind. A car passed on Birchwood Lane. The street was completely still. I went to bed that night feeling better than I had in months. I didn't know yet that the eyes watching over my house were not watching over me at all. 3 weeks after the cameras went live, I woke up at 2 in the morning and lay completely still in the dark, listening. It wasn't a sound I could name exactly. More like a disturbance, the way a house settles differently when something outside changes. A faint creak, maybe from the side gate. A soft compression of gravel that could have been the wind and could have been something else entirely. I held my breath and counted to 20. Nothing followed. I told myself it was a raccoon. Cedar Falls had a persistent raccoon problem in the fall, and Carol had waged a quiet war against them for years, reinforcing the compost bin, blocking gaps in the fence. I told myself it was the neighbor's cat, or a branch dropping in the yard, or just the particular way an old house breathes at 2 in the morning when it thinks nobody's paying attention. But my heart was going faster than it should have been for a man lying still in his own bed. And I lay there until the clock on the nightstand read 3:15 before I finally let my eyes close again. The next morning, I went straight to the TV before I even made coffee, pulling up the 4 camera feeds on the split screen the way Dale had shown me. Front porch clear, driveway clear, back patio clear, side entrance, and that's where my stomach dropped just slightly, the way it does when something that should be there isn't. The timestamp on the side entrance feed jumped. 10:47 p.m. straight to 3:22 a.m. 4.5 hours gone. I leaned closer to the screen, certain I was misreading it. I wasn't. I checked the back patio feed. Same jump. Same gap. Every single camera had the same black hole right in the middle of the night, like someone had reached in and pulled out the core of it. I stood up. My legs felt strange, not quite unsteady, but not fully reliable either. I picked up the phone and called Greg. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice easy and unhurried. "Morning, Dad. Everything okay?" "I'm not sure," I said. "There's a gap in the camera footage from last night. About 4.5 hours, all 4 cameras. It just jumps from 11 p.m. to 3 in the morning." A brief pause. "Huh. That's weird. It might be a storage glitch. These systems can drop frames when the hard drive gets fragmented. Did anything actually happen or just the gap? I heard something outside around 2. That's why I checked. Okay, don't worry about it. His voice was warm, reassuring, the voice of a man explaining something simple to someone who doesn't quite understand. I'll come by after work and take a look. Probably just needs a firmware update. These things happen with new installs. He showed up at 6:15, moved through the living room, with the comfortable efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for, spent about 8 minutes doing something on the DVR unit that I couldn't follow, and straightened up with a satisfied nod. Fixed, he said. Corrupted storage sector. I cleared it out and updated the software. Shouldn't happen again. What caused it? Honestly, could be anything. Power fluctuation, temperature change, just bad luck on a new unit. He clapped me on the shoulder, firm and easy. The system's running clean now. You're good. I walked him to the door. He waved from the driveway, backed out, and was gone before the porch light had time to flicker. I stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear around the corner onto Maple. And I felt that loose thread feeling again, stronger this time, harder to dismiss. Not quite suspicion. Not yet. But something that had teeth, something that had decided to stay. A power fluctuation. A corrupted storage sector. 4.5 hours gone. Greg had explained it so smoothly, so immediately, like a man who'd already prepared the answer before I asked the question. I went back to the kitchen, poured the coffee I'd forgotten to make, and sat at the table where Carol's yellow curtains caught the last of the evening light. My heart was still going slightly faster than it should. And the question that had settled in my chest overnight, quiet, patient, and stubborn as a splinter, was not going anywhere at all. I didn't tell Greg what I was planning to do. I didn't tell Diane. I didn't tell anyone. Monday morning, while the neighborhood was still quiet and the frost on the grass hadn't fully melted, I unplugged the DVR unit from the cabinet, under the TV, wrapped it in an old bath towel, and set it on the passenger seat of my truck like I was transporting something fragile, which I suppose I was. Kowalski Electronics sat on the corner of 2nd and Grant, a narrow storefront that had been there since the late 90s, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a closed-down insurance office. I'd been there once before, 3 years back, when my desktop computer died, and I was desperate to recover 30 years of business files. Mike Kowalski had brought back everything, every last spreadsheet, every invoice, every record I thought I'd lost. He was the kind of technician who didn't ask unnecessary questions and didn't make you feel foolish for not understanding what he was doing. That was exactly what I needed that morning. A small bell rang when I pushed the door open. The place smelled like solder and old circuit boards, and every surface was covered in equipment in various stages of being taken apart or put back together. Mike looked up from a workbench at the back, a stocky man in his mid-30s with reading glasses, pushed up on his forehead, and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Engineer." "Mr. Calloway." He pulled off a latex glove and extended his hand. "Been a while. What have you got?" "Security DVR." I set the towel-wrapped unit on his counter and unwrapped it carefully. There's a gap in the footage from about 10 nights ago. 4.5 hours, all 4 cameras gone. The person who manages the system came and cleared it out, said it was a storage glitch. I want to know if that's what it actually was. Mike picked up the unit, turned it over in his hands, checked the model number on the back plate. "This is a Sentinel Pro series. Good unit." He looked at me over the counter. "When you say the person who manages it cleared it out, you mean they physically handled the unit or remote access?" "Remote." He did it from his phone. Mike nodded slowly, the way people nod when something confirms what they were already thinking. "Okay. Here's the thing about this model, it runs a dual-write system. Everything that records locally also gets pushed automatically to Sentinel's cloud server as a backup. It's a manufacturer feature, runs in the background. Most people don't know it's there because it's buried about 4 menus deep in the setup. My throat felt suddenly tight. So even if someone deleted the footage from the unit itself, the cloud copy would still exist, yeah. He set the unit down. Let me pull it up. Give me 20 minutes. One thing worth knowing, the cloud side of this system can only be wiped from Sentinel's own server backend. The admin app on a phone can delete local footage all day long, but it doesn't touch the cloud copy. Most installers never read far enough into the manual to find that out. He disappeared into the back room with the DVR and a laptop cable. I sat in the plastic chair beside the counter, the only chair in the place, and a young woman came out of nowhere and handed me a paper cup of coffee. I thanked her. I held it with both hands because my hands had started doing something I didn't want them to do. I stared at the scratched linoleum floor and told myself there was probably nothing there. Told myself I was a 65-year-old man who'd been living alone too long and had started jumping at shadows and vacant lots. Then Mike came back out. Mr. Calloway. His voice had gone flat and careful, the way voices go when they're trying not to carry too much weight. Come take a look at this. I stood up. My legs felt strange, not quite unsteady, but not fully reliable either. I set the coffee cup on the counter and walked to where he stood in front of the monitor. The timestamp in the corner read October 16th, 2:14 in the morning. The side entrance feed, my camera, my house. 2 figures came through the side door in the dark, no lights, just the pale glow of a phone flashlight bouncing off the hallway wall. They moved quickly and quietly, with the careful deliberateness of people who had thought about this beforehand. The first figure was slighter, moving ahead. The second followed close behind, pausing at the entrance to my home office. I knew them before they even reached the light. The way Diane tilted her head when she was concentrating, that small, particular angle she'd had since she was 12 years old and working on a puzzle at the kitchen table. The width of Greg's shoulders, the way he stood, with his weight slightly forward, always slightly forward, like a man permanently ready to move. My daughter. My son-in-law. Diane pulled open the top drawer of my filing cabinet. She worked fast, pulling out folders, spreading them flat on the desk, photographing each page with her phone. Greg stood near the door, watching the hallway, one hand resting on the frame. They were in that room for 14 minutes. I watched every second. When they left, closing the side door behind them with the careful click of people who didn't want to be heard. The camera caught Greg's profile for just a moment in the ambient light from the street. His expression was focused, satisfied. Mike reached over and paused the playback. He straightened up slowly and looked at me for a moment without saying anything, the look of a man who has just seen something he wishes he hadn't and is deciding how to proceed. Then he turned the monitor back toward me and pressed play. The coffee in my paper cup had gone cold. Outside the window, Cedar Falls was going about its Monday morning, like the world hadn't just shifted underneath my feet. "Who do you suggest I call?" I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Mike looked at me for a long moment, his eyes grave. "Someone you trust completely, Mr. Calloway. Someone who isn't in that footage." I set the cup down on the counter. I looked at the frozen image on the screen, the empty hallway of my own house, the filing cabinet drawer still open, the ghost of where my daughter had been standing 30 seconds before. 31 years of running a business had taught me one thing above all others: when the numbers don't add up, you don't guess at the cause. You go find it. "Can you make me a copy of everything?" I asked. "Already started," Mike said. I drove home from Mike's shop with the copied files on a USB drive sitting in my breast pocket and didn't touch them for the rest of the afternoon. I made dinner and didn't eat it. I watched the evening news without hearing a single word of it. I sat in Carol's chair, not my chair, hers, the wingback by the window. She had reupholstered herself in 2009. And I let the weight of the day settle over me the way cold settles into a house when the furnace kicks off and the silence moves in to fill the space. Then, when the street outside had gone completely quiet, and the clock on the mantel read 9:15, I got up, walked to the home office, and turned on the desk lamp. I pulled every folder from the top 2 drawers and spread them across the desk, the way I used to spread inventory reports at the end of a quarter, methodically left to right, oldest to newest, nothing skipped, and nothing assumed. The video had shown Diane photographing 4 specific folders. I found all 4 within 10 minutes. The deed to the house on Birchwood Lane, the original signed the year Carol and I bought this place in 1988 for $112,000, back when this neighborhood was still mostly young families and the apple tree in the backyard was barely taller than I was. 3 savings account statements. The life insurance policy I had taken out in 2019, $250,000, with Diane listed as sole beneficiary. And tucked at the back of the second drawer behind a folder of old tax returns I hadn't opened in years, the document I had nearly forgotten existed entirely. The power of attorney. I remembered the afternoon Greg had brought it to me. A Sunday, maybe 18 months back, arriving with a stack of tax organization paperwork he had offered to help me sort through after my right hand had begun giving me trouble with fine motor work. Gripping a pen for long stretches had grown uncomfortable, not debilitating, nothing that stopped me from functioning, just enough to be a persistent annoyance that Greg had noticed and had been thoughtful enough, or so I had believed, to address. "It's just a convenience document, Dad," he had said, setting it casually on top of the pile, as though it were no more significant than any other page in the stack. "So I can help you with bills and accounts if your hands act up. Standard stuff. My buddy at the bank uses the same setup with his parents." I had signed it without reading it carefully. I had trusted him completely, the way you trust someone you have known for years. Someone who sits at your table every Sunday and calls you Dad and brings good wine and laughs easily. I had trusted him the way you trust family, which is to say, without the wariness you extend to strangers, and that distinction had cost me. I sat down at the desk now and read every single word of it. By the second page, my chest felt like something was pressing outward from the inside, a slow and steady pressure that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with what I was reading. By the third page, my hands were trembling, not the familiar arthritic tremor that came and went in my right hand, like an old acquaintance, but something different and deeper, something that originated in my core and worked its way outward through my arms until my fingers could barely hold the page flat against the desk. This was not a document about helping with bills. It granted Greg authority over financial decisions, and I read this particular passage 3 full times, to be certain I was not misreading the language real property transactions on my behalf, subject to certain specified conditions. The wording was careful and precise and thoroughly technical, the kind of legal language that sounds measured and reassuring when you are moving through it quickly, and sounds like something else entirely when you stop and read every clause at the speed it deserves. "Ray," I said out loud to no one in the room, to Carol on the shelf, to myself in the lamplight. "You trusted too fast." I opened my laptop and pulled up the online banking portal. I went back 6 months in the transaction history, moving through it, the way I used to audit the store, accounts at year-end, line by line, no skipping forward, no deciding in advance that something was probably fine. May $200 transferred to an account number I did not recognize. June $350. July $180. August $290. September $220. Each one small enough to pass at a glance for an automatic payment or a forgotten subscription. Each one landing just beneath the threshold where I might have paused and called the bank to ask a question. $12,480. gone in amounts carefully sized to be invisible. I pushed back from the desk and pressed both palms flat against the surface, steadying myself against the wood and the stillness of the room. I thought about Carol, who had said more than once with the particular fond exasperation of a woman who had been married to the same man for decades, that I was the most trusting skeptic she had ever met. Skeptical of strangers, she meant. Credulous of family, of the people who sat at my table and called me by name. She had tried to warn me in her way, in the quiet and indirect way she had of pointing toward things she thought I needed to see. I simply hadn't known what I was supposed to be looking for. I picked up the power of attorney document again and held it directly under the lamp. At the bottom of the last page, positioned neatly beside my own signature, sat the notary seal and the date 16 months ago. I had no clear memory of signing anything with this scope and reach. I remembered signing something quick, something Greg had described as routine and minor, something that had arrived embedded in a larger stack of papers. I had trusted him to organize and summarize for me, because my hand was bothering me, and I had been glad, genuinely glad, to have someone willing to help. That had not been routine. It had been a door quietly identified and carefully unlocked while I was looking somewhere else, available to be opened whenever the time was right. I needed someone who spoke this particular language far more fluently than I did. Someone whose profession was to find precisely what I had just found, sitting under my desk lamp, to name it with exactness, and to tell me plainly what it meant under Iowa law and what could be done about it. I knew one person who fit that description, and I had known him for 20 years without ever needing him the way I needed him now. I picked up the phone and called David Holt's office. The answering service picked up. I left a message asking for the earliest appointment he could make available the following week, kept my voice steady, thanked the service, and set the phone back down. Then I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark office with Carol's photograph on the shelf across from me, her face half visible in the thin light coming through the window from the street, and I tried to remember how to breathe normally. I sat there for a long time. David Holt's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that had been there since 1923 and looked like it intended to stay indefinitely. Dark wood paneling, bookshelves running floor to ceiling, on two walls a desk the size of a small country. The kind of office that said, whatever you're about to tell me, I've heard something like it before, and I'm still here. I'd known David since 2001, when he drafted the first lease agreement for the Calloway building supply expansion. He'd handled the sale of the store in 2021, 3 months of paperwork and negotiation that he'd guided me through without once making me feel like I didn't understand what I was signing. He was 60, maybe 62, with reading glasses. He was always losing and finding on top of his own head, and the particular unhurried manner of a man who had learned that rushing a conversation rarely shortened it. He stood up when I came in, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Ray, good to see you, though. I'll admit your message had me a little concerned." He settled into his chair and folded his hands on the desk. "You said it was time-sensitive." "I think so, yes." I set the folder on his desk, the POA document, on top the bank statements underneath the USB drive from Mike's shop sitting to the side. "I need you to read that first page and tell me what it actually says." David picked up the power of attorney document, pulled his glasses down from the top of his head where they'd been resting, and started reading. He was quiet for about 2 minutes, the particular quiet of someone absorbing information rather than simply passing their eyes over it. "Where did this come from?" he asked without looking up. "My son-in-law brought it to me about 16 months ago, along with some tax paperwork he was helping me organize. He described it as a convenience document, said it was just so he could help me with bills if my hands gave me trouble." David looked up over the top of his glasses. "Ray, this isn't a bill payment authorization." My chest tightened. "I know that now. Tell me exactly what it is." It's a durable power of attorney with broad financial authority. David set it flat on the desk and ran his finger along the second paragraph. This language here, including decisions related to real property held in the principal's name, that's not standard bill help language. That gives your son-in-law the authority to make decisions about this property. Your house, under certain conditions. The words hit me like a fist to the sternum. I exhaled slowly. What conditions? It's written as a springing POA, meaning it's supposed to become active only if you're determined to be incapacitated. But David paused, tapping the document. The incapacity clause here is loosely written. Loose enough that a motivated person could argue it applies in circumstances that you or I would not consider genuine incapacity. Meaning Greg could use it now. Meaning with the right paperwork supporting his position, he might try to. David leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together. Ray, I have to ask you something directly. Do you remember signing this? I remember signing something Greg described as routine. I do not remember this being described as anything close to what it actually is. David's jaw tightened slightly, just enough for me to notice. Did anyone witness you signing it, a notary? There's a notary seal on the last page. He flipped to it, studied it for a moment, and then set the document aside and picked up the bank statements I'd included. He went through them quickly, the way lawyers go through financial documents, not reading every word, but knowing exactly which numbers matter and where to find them. $12,480, I said. 6 months. I see it. He set the statements down and looked at me steadily. Ray, I want to be honest with you. The POA alone is troubling but not necessarily criminal without more context. The withdrawals are suspicious but small enough to be argued as authorized. What I need to know is whether there's any larger transaction, anything involving the property itself, that may have already been initiated using this document. That's what I need you to find out. I'll pull the county property records today. If there's been any filing against this address, a lien, a transfer motion, anything at all, it'll show up. He picked up a legal pad and wrote something at the top. Give me until Friday, and Ray. He looked up and his voice had the weight of someone choosing words carefully. Don't discuss this with your son-in-law. Don't let him know you've been here. I had no intention of it, I said. I stood up to go. At the window behind David's desk, 4 floors below Main Street, moved at its usual pace a woman walking a golden retriever, 2 kids on bikes cutting across the crosswalk, a delivery truck idling outside the hardware store. The ordinary architecture of a Thursday morning in a town where people still trusted each other. I used to love that about Cedar Falls. Standing there with the folder under my arm and David Holt's careful face behind me, I felt that love curdle into something much colder. Friday, I said. Friday, David confirmed. I'll call you the moment I have something. I walked out into the November air, got in my truck, and sat with both hands on the steering wheel for a long moment before I started the engine. My right hand was trembling, the real tremor this time, the one that came from age and not from fear. I gripped the wheel tighter and told myself there was a difference between the two. I wasn't sure I believed it. David called on Friday afternoon at 4:53. I know the exact time because I'd been watching the clock since 2 o'clock, pretending to read a novel I'd picked up at the library and hadn't absorbed a single page of. Ray. His voice had that particular quality I'd learned to read over 20 years, measured careful, the tone of a man who has bad news and intends to deliver it with precision rather than drama. Are you somewhere you can talk? I'm home. Go ahead. I pulled the county property records for Birchwood Lane. No transfer has been filed yet. No lien. Nothing recorded against the deed. He paused just long enough for me to start exhaling. But I found something else. something that concerns me more than the records themselves. I gripped the phone tighter. Tell me. I contacted the property records office and cross-referenced recent inquiry activity on your address. There's a name that came up through a local real estate agent, a broker on the east side of town who received an inquiry about your property approximately 6 weeks ago. The person asking was not your son-in-law directly. The name on the inquiry was Frank DeLuca. The name meant nothing to me. Who is Frank DeLuca? That's exactly what I spent the rest of the week finding out. I heard papers shifting on David's end. Frank DeLuca is Greg's first cousin. They grew up together in Peoria, Illinois. He currently lives in Davenport, about 90 minutes from Cedar Falls, and he has 2 civil judgments against him in Illinois courts, both from the last 8 years, both involving real estate transactions. My stomach dropped to somewhere around my knees. What kind of transactions? The first one involved a family member, an elderly aunt who signed a property transfer that she later claimed she didn't fully understand. The case was settled out of court, so the details are limited, but the judgment required DeLuca to return proceeds from a sale. The second case was a similar pattern. A property transferred using a power of attorney document buyer turned out to be a DeLuca-connected LLC. That one settled for just over $40,000. I stood up from the couch without meaning to. My legs were carrying me toward the window before I'd made any conscious decision to move the way a body sometimes knows it needs to be vertical before the mind catches up. "David," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped hollow from the inside. "Are you telling me Greg has done this before?" "I'm telling you Frank DeLuca has done this before, through a pattern that your son-in-law appears to be replicating." David's voice stayed even, but I could hear the weight behind it. "Ray, this isn't a family misunderstanding. This isn't impulsive bad judgment. What you're describing, the POA, the small withdrawals, the inquiry on your property, this is a methodology. Someone taught it, or someone learned it from watching it work." The November light outside the window was going gray and flat, the kind of afternoon that looks like a photograph of itself. I pressed one hand against the cold glass and felt the chill run straight up my arm. "What can I do with what you have right now?" I asked. "Honestly, file a complaint with the Iowa Attorney General's Elder Financial Exploitation Division." "But Ray..." David hesitated, and in 20 years of knowing him, I had never once heard him hesitate. "If we move now, Greg's attorney will argue confusion, misunderstanding, claim you verbally authorized things you've since forgotten. The POA gives him cover. The withdrawals are small enough to be dismissed. We would be handing them a narrative they've probably already prepared. So we need more. We need something they can't argue around, intent on the record in their own words or actions." Another pause. "How much time do you need?" I thought about Frank DeLuca, 90 minutes away, already asking questions about my house. I thought about the 16 months this had already been in motion while I was making Sunday dinners and watching football and sleeping soundly in the house Carol and I had paid off together. "As much as it takes to do this right," I said. "Then be careful," David said. "And Ray, don't change anything about your routine. Don't let them know anything has shifted. Not yet." I told him I understood. I set the phone down on the windowsill and stood there looking out at Birchwood Lane until the streetlights came on one by one and the neighborhood settled into its ordinary Friday evening. Greg had a cousin with a pattern, a methodology. And somewhere between the springing POA and the East Side real estate broker, my house had already become a transaction in someone else's plan. I went to the kitchen and made coffee I didn't need, and I started thinking about what it would take to give them exactly enough rope. They still came every Sunday, same time 1:30 in the afternoon, Greg's truck in the driveway. He through the back door first. Same smiles. Same questions about whether I'd been sleeping, Whether the knee was bothering me, whether I wanted Greg to take a look at the furnace filter because he'd noticed it seemed like it might be time. I sat across the table from them and smiled back, and passed the bread basket, and asked about Sophie's school project. And behind every single word I said, I was watching them the way I used to watch numbers on a balance sheet, looking for the figure that didn't belong. I noticed things I'd missed before. The way Greg refilled my coffee cup before I'd asked. Not out of thoughtfulness, I understood now, but out of the habit of a man who needed me to feel taken care of. The way Diane laughed just a half-second too quickly at things that weren't quite funny enough to warrant it. The performance of ease from someone who wasn't entirely at ease. Small things. The kind of things you only see when you already know what you're looking for. "Dad," Diane said, clearing the lunch plates with practiced efficiency. "I've been thinking, you really don't need to keep track of all the accounts yourself anymore. You've earned the rest. Greg could set up automatic payments, handle the monthly oversight, take that whole burden off your plate." I tilted my head and let a small, considering look cross my face, the expression of a man genuinely weighing a reasonable suggestion. "That's thoughtful, sweetheart. Let me think on it." "There's nothing complicated about it," Greg said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, warm and reasonable. "I just log in once a month, make sure everything's running clean. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." "You know me," I said, and smiled. "Old habits. I like knowing where every dollar is." Greg smiled back. "Of course, no rush." Sophie tugged my sleeve from the chair beside me. "Grandpa, can we go see if the roses are still alive? Mom said they were probably dead, but I told her they weren't." "Your mother underestimates those roses," I said, and pushed back from the table. "Come on." We walked out to the back garden together. Sophie's hand in mine, and I let the cold air clear my head while she crouched down to inspect the base of Carol's rose bushes with the serious scientific attention of a 9-year-old who has decided something is her responsibility. "They're not dead," she announced. "See? There's green right here at the bottom." "There always is," I told her. "Some things look gone and aren't." After a while, I told Sophie I was going to get the mail, and she stayed in the garden, entirely absorbed in her rose investigation. I walked around the side of the house to the mailbox at the end of the front path. 3 bills, a circular from the hardware store, and then instead of going back in through the front door, the way I usually did, I came around the far side of the house to the kitchen entrance. Old habit from 30 years of coming and going through the side door at the store, the route I took without thinking. I heard Greg's voice before I touched the handle. "The more his hands shake, the easier this gets." I stopped. My hand was 3 inches from the door. The cold air felt suddenly thinner, like there wasn't quite enough of it. Diane's voice lower. "Give it a few more months. Nobody's going to take his word over the paperwork." Greg again, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach turn over, not cruelty exactly, but a casual confidence, the voice of a man discussing a project he considers nearly complete. "DeLuca says 60 days once we have the transfer. I want this done before spring." "It'll be done before spring," Diane said, and then quieter with a laugh so light it barely registered as human. "He barely looked at what he signed last year. He's not going to start looking now." I stood on the other side of that door for what felt like a very long time, but was probably no more than 15 seconds. My heart was slamming against my ribs hard enough that I was briefly certain they could hear it. My hand against the door frame was trembling. Not the arthritic tremor, not the hands getting older tremor, but something entirely different. Something that started in my chest and radiated outward like cracks in ice. My daughter. Laughing. I thought about Carol. I thought about the 38 years we'd spent in this house, the Sunday dinners she'd cooked in that kitchen, the way she'd held Diane as a baby in the chair by the window. I thought about how Carol had cried the day Diane got married, Happy tears, proud tears, the tears of a woman who believed she'd raised someone worth loving. I coughed once loud enough to carry and pushed the door open. "There he is," Greg said, turning from the counter with an easy smile, coffee mug in hand. Not a flicker, not a tremor. The man was good, I'd give him that. "Mail?" Diane asked brightly. "Hardware store circular." I set the stack on the counter and looked at her face, the face I'd watched grow from infant to child to woman, and found nothing there I could name as guilt. Just the smooth, practiced surface of someone who had made their decision a long time ago and had stopped second-guessing it. "Sophie thinks the roses survived," I said. Diane smiled. "She always was optimistic." "Gets it from her grandmother," I said. I walked past both of them to the sink, filled a glass of water, and drank it slowly, while I looked out the window at Sophie still crouched in the garden, entirely unaware, entirely innocent, the one person in this family who had no angle and no agenda and no plan that involved taking anything from anyone. She was the reason I hadn't walked back through that door swinging. She was the reason I was going to do this carefully, methodically, and right the way I'd handled every hard thing in 30 years of business. When they left that afternoon, Sophie hugged me so hard at the door that I had to brace against the frame. I held on a full second longer than usual and pressed my cheek against the top of her head. "See you next Sunday, Grandpa." "Count on it, sweetheart," I said. "Count on it." Carol's chair was by the east window, the one that caught the morning light first. She'd reupholstered it herself in 2009, a deep blue fabric she'd driven 40 minutes to find at a fabric store in Waterloo, because the one in Cedar Falls didn't carry the right shade. I hadn't sat in it since the week after her funeral, when I'd lowered myself into it at 2 in the morning, because I needed to feel close to something that still held her shape. That December night, I sat in it again. The house was quiet the way it only gets after 10 o'clock in winter. The particular silence of cold pressing against walls of a street gone still outside. I didn't turn on the lamp. I just sat in the dark with my hands loose in my lap and let everything I'd learned in the past 6 weeks arrange itself in front of me like a ledger. On one side, a forged power of attorney. $12,000 gone in small, careful pieces. A cousin with a pattern and a real estate broker already asking questions. My daughter laughing in my kitchen about how I wouldn't notice until it was done. On the other side, not enough. Not yet. "What would you do?" I said out loud to Carol, to the dark, to whatever version of her still lived in the weave of that blue fabric. She didn't answer, of course, but I knew what she'd say. She'd say that I had always been better at the long game than I gave myself credit for. She'd say that patience wasn't weakness, it was the thing that had kept Calloway Building Supply alive through 3 recessions, while other hardware stores folded around us. She'd say, "Don't let them know you're coming until you're already there." I picked up the phone and called David at 7 the next morning. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been awake for a while. "Ray, I was going to call you today." "I need to come in," I said. "I have a plan, and I need to know if it's something you can help me execute." 2 hours later, I was sitting across from his desk again, and I laid it out plainly. "I want them to believe the plan is working," I said. "I want Greg to think I'm declining, forgetting things, getting confused, becoming exactly the kind of man who wouldn't notice what's happening to his own finances. While I'm doing that, I want you to prepare a property transfer document, my house to Greg, that looks completely legitimate but has no actual legal validity." David leaned forward. "A decoy document. A decoy document. Something specific enough to look real, official enough to make them move. I'll leave it somewhere Greg is likely to find it. When he takes it, when they act on it, I'll have them on camera doing exactly what they've been doing. And this time I'll have the document itself as evidence of intent." David was quiet for a moment, fingers pressed together, the way he did when he was thinking through the architecture of something. It's not entrapment legally speaking because you're not law enforcement, and you're not inducing them to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise commit. They're already in motion. You'd just be giving them a specific opportunity to demonstrate it. He looked at me steadily. But Ray, once we do this, we need to see it through. No halfway measures. I haven't done anything halfway in 65 years, I said. I'm not starting now. Something shifted in David's expression, not quite a smile, but the look of a man who has decided he respects what he's hearing. He picked up his legal pad. I'll need 2 weeks to draft something that passes a quick visual inspection, but fails on a technical clause buried deep enough that they won't catch it in the moment. He wrote something at the top of the page. In the meantime, I need you to be very careful, consistent. Give them nothing that suggests your thinking has changed. I stood up and buttoned my coat. My hands were steady. For the first time in weeks, genuinely steady. David, I said at the door. Thank you for not telling me this was a bad idea. He looked up over his glasses. It's not a bad idea, Ray. It's the only idea that accounts for all the variables. He paused. Carol would have approved. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer that. I just nodded and walked out into the December cold, and for the first time since October, I felt something in my chest that wasn't grief or dread, or the sick, hollow weight of betrayal. It felt cautiously and carefully like purpose. Acting is harder than it looks. I'd spent 65 years being exactly who I was, a man who remembered every invoice number, every client's birthday, every price per board, foot of cedar going back to 1994. Now I had to dismantle that reputation piece by piece in front of people who thought they already knew me without dismantling it so thoroughly that they started to wonder why the change was so sudden. The first performance was on a Sunday, 2 weeks into December. Sophie was drawing at the kitchen table when I walked in, tongue between her teeth, the way she concentrated. Greg and Diane were standing at the counter, and I stopped in the doorway with a deliberately uncertain look and said, Sophie, honey, remind me, when's your birthday again? Sophie looked up a little surprised. March 15th, Grandpa. Same as always. Of course it is. I shook my head and let out a small, embarrassed laugh, the laugh of a man who has just caught himself forgetting something he's known for 9 years. I don't know where my head is these days. From the corner of my eye, I caught it, Greg and Diane exchanging a glance over Sophie's head. Quick, loaded. The glance of two people who have just been handed confirmation of something they'd been watching for. I kept my face soft and slightly puzzled and went to pour myself a glass of water. 3 days later, I called Diane at noon on a Wednesday. Sweetheart, what day is it today? I've been going back and forth between Tuesday and Wednesday all morning, and I can't get it straight. There was a brief pause before she answered, the pause of someone recalibrating. It's Wednesday, Dad, the 11th. Wednesday, right, of course. I let a thread of frustration into my voice, the sound of a man annoyed at himself. Thank you, honey. I don't know what's gotten into me lately. Don't worry about it. Her voice had gone gentle, in a particular way, not the warmth of a daughter worried about her father, but something smoother and more careful, the gentleness of someone managing a situation. That happens, Dad. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window and felt something cold and sad move through me, because she hadn't sounded worried. She'd sounded relieved. The physical performance was next. I'd noticed Greg watching my hands, specifically my right hand, the one with the arthritic tremor that came and went. He'd been watching it since September, I realized now, tracking it the way you track weather on a forecast. At the next Sunday dinner, I let the tremor run a little further than I usually would, And when I picked up my coffee mug, I used both hands and let them shake just enough to make Diane reach out instinctively. "I've got it," I said, pulling back gently. "I've got it." Greg watched me set the mug down. I saw something pass through his face, not sympathy, not exactly. Satisfaction. The quiet, private satisfaction of a man watching a timeline accelerate. He started speaking to me differently after that. Slower. Louder, as though volume were a form of clarity. He'd started repeating instructions I'd understood perfectly the first time. "So just press this button, Dad, this one right here," with the careful patience of someone who had already decided the person across from them needed a simpler version of every sentence. The thing about being underestimated is that it makes you furious. And the thing about being furious is that you have to put it somewhere, or it shows up in your face at the worst possible moment. I put mine in Carol's old writing desk, the one in the bedroom she'd used for correspondence, with the small brass lock and the key she'd kept on a hook inside the closet. Every evening I sat at that desk and wrote down everything I'd observed that day. The exact words Greg had used. The way Diane's voice changed on the phone. How many seconds Greg watched my hands before he looked away. 30 years of running a business had taught me that the person with the most accurate records wins. Every time. One evening in early January, Greg stopped by, alone, said he was in the neighborhood just checking in. He helped himself to a glass of water from my kitchen, the way he'd started doing, comfortable as a man in his own home. And while he was talking about something to do with his work, I watched him let his gaze drift very briefly to the door of my home office. He looked away in under 2 seconds, but he looked. "You doing okay, Dad?" he asked, turning back to me with that open, easy smile. "You seem a little tired." "Just getting old," I said, and shook my head with a small, resigned chuckle. He patted my shoulder on the way out. Firm, proprietary. The touch of a man who had already in his own mind begun to take possession of something. I locked the front door behind him and stood in the hallway until his truck headlights swept past the window and disappeared. Then I went to Carol's writing desk, opened it with the brass key, and wrote down every detail I could remember about the exact direction of his gaze, the exact duration, and exactly what was in my home office that he was trying to see. The moment Greg stopped being careful around me was the moment I knew the performance was working. He thought he was watching a man fade. He had no idea he was watching a man aim. While Greg was sitting at his office desk that Tuesday morning, believing he had a confused and fading father-in-law on Birchwood Lane, I put on my good wool coat, the charcoal gray one Carol had picked out for me at Yonkers, the Christmas before she got sick, and drove to Cedar Falls First National Bank. I'd banked there since 1989. My business accounts, my personal accounts, the joint savings Carol and I had opened the year Diane was born. The branch manager, a steady-handed woman named Patricia, who'd processed the wire transfer when I sold Calloway building supply, looked up from her desk when I walked in and gave me the warm, practiced smile of someone genuinely glad to see a familiar face. "Mr. Calloway, what can I do for you today?" I sat down across from her, folded my hands on the desk, and said it plainly. "I need to make some changes to all of my accounts. Today, if possible." She pulled up my profile without hesitation. "Of course. What kind of changes?" "New passwords on everything. Close the existing checking and open a new account with a new number. Remove all secondary authorizations currently on file." I slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. "And I'd like all future statements and notifications sent to this address instead of Birchwood Lane." The address was a P.O. box, a postal box I'd rented at the Cedar Falls post office that morning, $32 for 6 months paid in cash. Nothing connected to the house. Nothing Greg could intercept. Patricia glanced at the paper, then back at me, with the careful professionalism of someone trained not to ask questions she doesn't need the answers to. Security concerns, something like that. I said. She nodded once and got to work. It took 40 minutes, the unhurried, thorough 40 minutes of someone doing things correctly. And when we were done, every account Greg had ever touched, every authorization he'd been granted, every notification that had been flowing quietly to his phone for the past year and a half, was gone. Cut clean. As if it had never existed. I thanked. Patricia shook her hand and walked out into the January cold, feeling lighter than I had in months. The bank visit was the second step. The first had been 2 days earlier when David prepared a one-page revocation of the power of attorney under Iowa Code, Section 633, A.3109, and I signed it in his office. He filed it with the Lynn County Recorder that same afternoon. As of that filing, the document Greg had slipped into a stack of tax papers 16 months ago was legally dead. Whatever authority it had granted him existed now only as evidence of what he'd intended to do with it. My chest felt like something that had been wound too tight for too long had finally been allowed one full rotation in the right direction. That afternoon, I drove to David's office to pick up the document he'd spent 2 weeks preparing. He had it waiting in a manila envelope on the corner of his desk. Before he handed it over, he opened it and walked me through it the way a surgeon explains a procedure clearly without hedging. "It's a property transfer agreement," he said, setting it flat between us. "Correct letterhead, correct format, my office seal on the cover page, your signature, and a notary stamp on the last page." He pointed to the third page. "Here is where it fails. Under Iowa Code, a deed transferring real property requires a notary acknowledgement using specific statutory language that was updated in 2019 under Iowa Code Section 9B.14. This document uses the pre-2019 form. The wording looks official at a glance, but any title company running a standard search before closing would flag it within minutes. It fails on a technical clause buried deep enough that someone who wants to believe it's real won't catch it reading quickly. They won't read it carefully," I said. "They'll see what they want to see." "That's what I'm counting on." David slid the envelope across the desk. "Ray, once they take this document and act on it, photograph it, attempt to use it, even just remove it from your home, that's evidence of intent. Combined with the video from October and the bank records, it builds a pattern a prosecutor can work with." I picked up the envelope. It was heavier than I expected, the way important things sometimes are. "1 more week of the performance," I said. "Maybe 2. "However long it takes," David said. "But Ray, be careful with that document. It's the hook. Don't let it leave your sight until you're ready to cast it." I drove home on the long way past the lot where Calloway Building Supply used to stand, now a yoga studio with a cheerful orange sign in the window. Carol had always said that building had good bones and would outlast us both. She'd been half right. I already knew exactly which drawer I was going to leave the document in, and I already knew which Thursday Greg would come by alone. Greg came by alone that Thursday, the way he sometimes did in winter. Stopping in on his lunch break, he said, just to check on me. He always had a reason that sounded like kindness and worked like a key. I heard his truck in the driveway at 12:17. I know the exact time because I'd been watching the clock since 11 the way you watch a pot. You need to boil at a specific moment and not a moment before. The transfer document was on the desk in the home office. Not hidden, not displayed. Just present the way a man who was getting forgetful might leave important papers out because he'd been looking at them and then gotten distracted. The folder sat open on the left side of the desk, the top page facing up, the title visible from the doorway, Property Transfer Agreement, 114 Birchwood Lane. I'd positioned it at 11:45 using the same careful geometry I used to use when arranging store displays, visible enough to catch the eye, positioned naturally enough not to look placed. I was in the kitchen when he knocked, and let himself in with his spare key. "Hey, Dad." He came through the hallway with the easy stride of a man perfectly comfortable in someone else's home. "How are you feeling today?" "Oh, you know." I waved a hand with the slightly vague gesture I'd been cultivating for 6 weeks. "Up and down. Some days are better than others. That's normal." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You eating okay? I had oatmeal this morning." I turned back to the stove. "Coffee, I was just about to make some." "Sure, yeah." He set his keys on the counter. The keys that included my spare, the key I had not yet asked for, back, and I heard him shift his weight behind me toward the hallway. "Mind if I use the bathroom?" "Go ahead." The bathroom was past the home office. The home office door was open. I focused on filling the kettle, measuring out the grounds, the small, deliberate choreography of making coffee for two. My hands were loose. My breathing was even. Every molecule of concentration I had was pointed at the back of my own head, listening for the small sounds that would tell me what was happening 6 feet down the hallway. I heard his footsteps past the office door, then slow, then stop. Not the stop of someone who needed to pause for any natural reason. The specific stop of someone whose eye has caught something they weren't expecting. 12 seconds. I counted them against the drip of the faucet. Then his footsteps resumed and the bathroom door clicked shut. When he came back to the kitchen, I had 2 mugs on the counter and was studying the hardware store circular I'd left on the table with the glazed attention of a man who had read it 3 times without retaining anything. "Anything good in there?" Greg asked, nodding at the circular. "They've got a sale on snowblowers," I said. "Bit late in the season for that." He laughed, easy, relaxed, the laugh of a man whose pulse had just gone back to normal. "Little bit, yeah. We drank coffee." He asked about my doctor's appointment next week. I told him it was just the regular checkup, nothing special. He nodded and said he was glad I was keeping on top of it. Every word was perfectly calibrated, perfectly warm, and about as genuine as a store window. He left 20 minutes later, faster than his usual visits, which typically ran 40 minutes to an hour. He had an afternoon meeting, he said. Very believable. Very prompt. I stood at the front window and watched him pull out of the driveway, and I felt something electric move through me, not quite satisfaction, not yet, but the particular tension of a man who has set something in motion and now has to trust the current to carry it. That evening at 7:43, my phone rang. Diane. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was bright and even and just slightly too relaxed, the vocal equivalent of someone who had practiced their opening line. "Just checking in. How are you feeling?" "Fine, sweetheart. Had a good afternoon, actually. Greg came by for coffee." "Oh, that's nice." A beat fractionally too long, a quarter second of recalibration. "He mentioned that. Said you seemed like you were in good spirits." "Tell him I appreciated the company, so," I said. "It gets quiet here in the evenings." "I will, Dad. I love you." "Love you too, honey." I set the phone face down on the counter, and I stood there feeling the particular weight of those 3 words. Words, I still meant words. I suspected she still meant, in whatever version of love had survived, what she'd decided to do. And I pressed the heel of my hand flat against the countertop until the pressure steadied me. The hook was in. She'd called within 7 hours of Greg's visit. Now I just had to wait for them to pull. I had not slept past midnight in the 3 nights since Greg's visit. Every evening I went through the same routine, locked the doors, turned off the lights, lay down in the dark with my phone on the pillow beside me and the camera app open on the screen. The motion sensor on the side entrance was set to alert with a single vibration, no sound. I'd changed that setting myself quietly the week before. Greg had set it to chime. I needed it silent. The first 2 nights were nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of a house settling into winter, the neighbor's porch light triggering the front camera briefly, At 11 a car turning around in the driveway at 1 in the morning and pulling away. I lay there each time with my heart rate climbing and then falling back down, staring at the ceiling, until 4 a.m. when exhaustion finally pulled me under. The third night, Friday, I felt it before the phone vibrated. Some shift in the quality of the dark outside, some change in the pressure of the house. I'd been a light sleeper since Carol died. 5 years of lying awake, listening for nothing, had sharpened something in me I hadn't asked to develop. The phone vibrated at 2:14 a.m., side entrance. Motion detected. I pressed the live feed icon with a thumb that was trembling so badly I missed it twice before the screen opened. The side entrance camera. The door was moving slow, careful, the deliberate movement of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how far it could open before the hinge creaked. 2 figures. Diane first, then Greg. My chest locked up so completely that for a moment I genuinely could not draw breath. I pressed my free hand flat against the mattress and forced one slow inhale through my nose, then another, the way Carol used to tell me to breathe when I was furious about something at the store. In through the nose ray, all the way down. Through the phone speaker, I had the volume turned to the lowest possible setting. Barely a whisper, I could hear the soft sounds of movement in the hallway. The specific sound of my home office door, which had a slightly sticky lower hinge I'd never gotten around to fixing. Then, the thin blue-white beam of a phone flashlight appearing and disappearing in the crack under the bedroom door. Greg's voice so low it was nearly nothing. "It's here, the transfer document, right where he left it." The sound of pages turning. Then the quiet percussion of a phone camera shutter, once, twice, 5 times. And then Diane's voice, and I have replayed this moment more times than I can count, lying in the dark, in that bed, in that house, with everything Carol and I built together, existing on the other side of a wall, from the person we had built it for. "Mom's gone," she said softly, almost to herself, the way people say things they've been thinking for a long time, and have finally stopped bothering to keep internal. This house was always going to be mine anyway. Something in my chest didn't break. It didn't shatter the way things break in stories. It went very, very still, the particular stillness of something that has been holding on for a long time and has finally quietly let go. I lay with my eyes open in the dark and listened to the sound of my daughter moving through my home office, through the house her mother had chosen and painted and planted roses around, and I felt a grief so complete and so cold that it had passed entirely beyond tears. This was not the grief of surprise. This was the grief of confirmation, the moment when the thing you've been hoping wasn't true stops being deniable. She had decided this before any plan, before Greg, before the cameras and the POA and the careful small withdrawals. She had looked at this house and at her aging father and made a calculation about what she was owed. They were gone by 2:28. 14 minutes. The side door clicked shut with the same careful precision it had opened with. I lay there until 4:15. I did not cry. I did not move. I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the Sunday afternoons when Diane was 7 years old and used to fall asleep on Carol's lap in that very living room, and I thought about the birthday cards she'd made me out of construction paper every year until she was 11, and I thought about the way she'd called me from her college dorm the night before her first big exam because she was scared, and I was still the person she called when she was scared. When the first gray light started coming through the curtains, I sat up slowly, put both feet on the floor, and looked at my hands. They were steady, completely, genuinely steady, not the steadiness of performance, not the forced calm of a man willing himself to hold together. The steadiness of someone who had passed through the worst of something and come out the other side with the map. I picked up the phone and opened the camera footage, The recording was clean, clear time-stamped, and irrefutable. I was ready. 2 days after I lay awake until dawn listening to my daughter take photographs of a document that would never hold up in any court in Iowa, I called Greg on a Tuesday evening to remind him about my doctor's appointment that Wednesday. I didn't need to remind him. I'd been keeping that appointment on the first Wednesday of every month for 3 years, ever since my cardiologist suggested quarterly checkups after Carol died, and I'd stopped eating regularly for about 6 months. Greg knew the schedule, but I wanted him to hear it from me directly with the slightly scattered quality I'd been cultivating for 2 months. "Just wanted to let you know I'll be out Wednesday afternoon," I said, letting a vague note drift into my voice. 2 o'clock, the doctor's office on Ridgeway, in case you tried to reach me and wondered where I was. "Thanks for letting me know, Dad." His voice was warm and perfectly natural, and I could hear just underneath it the slight quickening of a man who has just been handed exactly what he needed. "Take care of yourself. Call me after if anything comes up." "Will do," I said. "Will do." I arrived at Dr. Brennan's office at 2 on the dot and sat through 40 minutes of blood pressure readings and a conversation about my vitamin D levels that I absorbed with approximately 20% of my attention. The other 80% was on Birchwood Lane. I got home at 4:23. The house looked exactly as I'd left it, doors locked. Nothing obviously disturbed the kind of surface calm that means nothing when you know what to look for. I made tea I didn't drink and sat down in front of the laptop. The footage started at 2:47 p.m. Greg's truck pulled into the driveway, and he came through the front door with his spare key, holding it open behind him for a man I'd never seen before in my life. Frank DeLuca was about 45 years old, heavier than Greg, with a dark jacket and the measured, assessing gait of someone who entered rooms and immediately began calculating their dimensions. He carried a small notebook and a retractable tape measure clipped to his belt, and the first thing he did when he stepped into my front hallway was look up at the ceiling. Not the ceiling the way a guest looks at a ceiling. The ceiling the way a buyer looks at a ceiling. "Nice bones," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the camera audio. "How old is the roof?" "Replaced in 2017, Greg said. Dad had it done after a bad hailstorm. All new insulation in the attic at the same time." Dad. The word landed in my chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples outward that I felt all the way to my fingertips. I watched Frank DeLuca walk through my house. He opened the kitchen cabinets. Carol's cabinets, the ones she'd repainted cream in 2015, because she said the original white had gone yellow, and it bothered her every time she cooked. He tested the kitchen faucet and it checked the water pressure. He pulled the tape measure from his belt and measured the width of the master bedroom doorway with the focused efficiency of a man for whom this was a transaction, not a home. "Living room's a good size," he said, writing in the notebook. "Could open it up to the kitchen easy if someone wanted an open plan." "The whole first floor is solid," Greg said. He was following Frank through the house like a real estate agent, relaxed and confident, his hands in his pockets. "Hardwood under the carpet in the bedrooms. Original to the house." Frank crouched down in the corner of the master bedroom and pressed on the floorboard, testing for softness, for rot, for any reason to lower an offer. He found nothing wrong because nothing was wrong. Carol and I had taken care of this house for 37 years. They went through the garage. Frank measured the depth. They stood on the back patio, Carol's patio, where we'd had Sunday evenings with iced tea for 20 summers, and Frank looked at the yard with the flat, calculating attention of a man pricing square footage. "Lot size?" he asked. "0.3 acres, Greg said. "Good privacy fence on the east side." Frank wrote something down and nodded slowly. At the front door, pulling on his jacket, he turned to Greg with the brisk finality of someone closing a mental ledger. "Tell him we can close in 60 days, he said. Price we discussed. I'll have my guy do a formal walkthrough once the paperwork clears. Greg nodded. I'll take care of it. The front door closed. I heard the truck start in the driveway. I watched the footage until both vehicles had pulled away from Birchwood Lane and the street was empty again. Then I picked up the phone and called David. They brought someone to the house today, I said when he answered. While I was at the doctor, a man named Frank DeLuca. He measured the rooms David. He measured Carol's bedroom. My voice cracked on the last word, just once, just slightly, like a hairline fracture in something I'd been holding rigid for months. He said 60 days to close. David's voice went very quiet and very precise. Ray, it's time. How soon can you come in? I looked around my kitchen. The yellow curtains, the cabinet handles. Carol had chosen the small ceramic rooster on the windowsill she'd bought at a craft fair in 2008, and that I'd always thought was ugly and had never once considered moving. Tomorrow morning, I said. First thing. I was in David's office by 8:15 the next morning, before Patricia had unlocked the bank, and before the coffee shop on the corner had flipped its sign to open. David was already there, jacket on legal pad, ready, the look of a man who had also not slept much. Tell me what we have, he said. I set the USB drive on his desk. Everything. The October footage of them in the office. 6 months of bank statements with the small withdrawals marked. The kitchen recording Greg's voice, Diane's voice, clear enough that a transcript wouldn't need any guesswork. The footage of Frank DeLuca walking through my house yesterday with a tape measure. I paused. And the recording from February 14th, the night they came back a second time. 2:14 a.m., Diane's voice. David didn't ask me to repeat it. He inserted the drive into his laptop and went through every file methodically, the way a good lawyer reviews evidence not for emotional response but for utility. What holds up? What tells the clearest story? What a jury or a prosecutor or an employer would understand in under 30 seconds. After 20 minutes, he leaned back and pressed his fingers together. Ray, this is more than enough to file a criminal complaint with the Iowa Attorney General's Elder Financial Exploitation Division. The POA alone, combined with the unauthorized entries and the recorded statements of intent, establishes a pattern. The DeLuca footage adds premeditation. He looked at me steadily. We could file today. I know, I said, but I don't want a complaint filed in an office somewhere that gets argued over for 2 years. I want them to have no room. I want every person in their lives to see this at the same moment they do. David studied me for a long moment. You have something specific in mind. Diane called me last night after we spoke. I looked at the window. March light was coming through thin and pale, the particular light of a season that hasn't fully committed yet. She wants to throw Sophie's birthday party at my house. April 12th. About 40 people. And you said yes. I said of course. I said I wouldn't have it any other way. Something moved across David's face, not quite a smile, but close. The expression of a man who has just seen a long game come into focus. He picked up his pen. Then we have 3 weeks, he said. Let's use them. We sat at that desk for 2 hours. David organized the evidence into a sequence chronological tight, each piece leading logically to the next, so that anyone watching would have no question about what they were seeing and no honest interpretation other than the correct one. The October footage first. Then the bank statements. Then the kitchen recording. Then Frank DeLuca measuring Carol's bedroom. Then last and heaviest, the recording from February. Diane's voice in the dark 8 words that could not be argued into meaning anything other than what they meant. I prepared the laptop and the HDMI cable that would connect it to the living room TV. I tested the connection twice, then a third time, because I was not going to stand in front of 40 people and have a technical failure be the thing that broke the moment. And then I prepared one more thing. I addressed a sealed envelope to the Human Resources Director at Greg's company, Meridian Project Solutions, a mid-sized construction management firm in Cedar Rapids, where Greg had worked for 11 years and held a position that required financial bonding. Inside the envelope was a USB drive containing copies of every piece of footage, every bank record, and a 2-page summary David had written on his firm's letterhead. I put a stamp on it and set it on the corner of my desk. I was not going to mail it. Not yet. But it would be there ready the moment the party ended. That evening at 6:47, Diane called. "Dad?" Her voice was warm and excited in a way I hadn't heard from her in a long time. "I have an idea. Sophie's birthday. I was thinking we could do it at your place. She loves your backyard. What do you think?" I let a beat pass the way a man does when he's genuinely pleased and slightly surprised. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. You know I love having people in this house. Maybe 40 people. Family, Sophie's friends from school, a few neighbors. Whatever Sophie wants," and I said, "This is her day. You're the best dad." Her voice softened in a way that made something ache behind my sternum, because it sounded real. It sounded exactly like the daughter I'd raised. "I love you. Love you too, honey." I set the phone down and sat with the sealed envelope on the corner of the desk and the USB drive next to the laptop, and 3 weeks between me and the end of something I couldn't yet fully imagine the shape of. 3 weeks. I had been performing for 4 months. 3 more weeks was nothing. I could do 3 more weeks standing on my head. The Sunday before Sophie's birthday was the last time I sat across from Greg and Diane at my own table and played the part they had written for me. I want to say something about that, because I think it matters. I knew it was the last time, and that knowledge changed the way I saw everything around me. It was the way you look at a place you are about to leave for good, not with longing exactly, but with the particular careful attention of someone committing details to memory before the door closes forever. The grain of the wood on the table Carol had found at an estate sale in 2003. The way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at 2 o'clock and turned the yellow curtains the color of weak honey. The sound of Sophie's sneakers moving across the hardwood in the hallway, quick and light, the way only a child's footsteps can be. I held each of these things in my mind and turned them over slowly, the way you turn a stone in your hand before setting it down for the last time. Some things I was going to miss. Some things I was going to be glad, deeply glad to set down. I had spent the past week learning to tell the difference, and I was becoming better at it with every passing hour. Greg arrived in a better mood than usual, expansive, easy, generous, the mood of a man who believes he can already see the finish line from where he is standing. He had brought a bottle of wine, a good one, and he held it up as he came through the front door with a grin that reached all the way to his eyes, the kind of grin that has no performance in it, no calculation. Whatever else Greg was doing, that grin was real. "Thought we'd celebrate," he said. "What are we celebrating?" I asked, wearing the mildly confused expression I had been quietly polishing for 4 months. Just enough puzzlement to be believable, not so much as to invite concern. "Spring," he said and laughed. "Just spring, Dad. Diane had made my favorite. Pot roast with carrots and rosemary from her own garden, because she knew I had let Carol's herb pots go over the winter and hadn't had the heart to replant them." She set the dish on the table with a warmth that was, I had come to understand over these long months, entirely genuine and entirely coexistent with what she was planning to do. That was the hardest part, to hold harder than the anger and harder than the grief. She could love me sincerely, could remember what I liked to eat, and drive across town to bring me rosemary and still be doing what she was doing. People carry contradictions in them that they themselves may not fully see. I had made my peace with that, or something close to it. "The party is going to be wonderful, Dad," she said, filling my glass with a careful, steady hand. "Sophie has talked about nothing else all week. She wants to know if your roses are going to bloom in time." "They always come back," I said. "Some things look gone and aren't." Diane smiled across the table at me. "That's sweet." She didn't know I wasn't talking about the roses. Halfway through the meal, Greg set his fork down with the comfortable ease of a man raising what he considers a perfectly ordinary, practical matter. He rested his forearms on the table and looked at me in the way a reasonable, helpful son looks at an aging father. "Dad, I was thinking Diane and I could come over Wednesday or Thursday, help you get the house ready before the party. Clear out some things in the garage. Make sure the patio furniture is all set up. Move some things around if you need more room for people." I looked at him across the table. A cold thread moved through my chest, thin and precise, because I understood exactly what "move some things around" meant. One last look through the filing cabinets. One last pass through the desk drawers. One last quiet inventory of everything in this house that would shortly, in his mind, belong to him. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, keeping my voice warm and unhurried. "But I think I can manage it on my own. I like having a project to work through. Keeps me sharp." I tapped the side of my head with one finger and gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle. What's left of it, anyway? Greg laughed, easy, relaxed, the laugh of a man who is not worried. "Of course, but the offer stands whenever you want it." "I know it does, son," I said. "I know it does." After lunch, Sophie pulled at my sleeve the way she always did when she had something to show me and couldn't wait another moment. She led me to the kitchen table where her drawing supplies were spread out in the comfortable disorder of a child at work. And she lifted a piece of paper from the table with both hands, holding it up in front of her, with her face bright and open, with the particular pride of a child who has made something and needs the right person to see it first. It was my house. Crayon lines careful and earnest, the yellow walls, the apple tree standing on the left side of the yard, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. A small figure on the front porch with gray hair standing, the way I stand, slightly forward, hands at the sides. It was almost exactly the drawing she had shown me the very first Sunday Greg had raised the idea of the cameras 7 months ago, in what felt now like another life entirely, when I had still believed the people sitting at my table were exactly who I thought they were. My throat tightened so sharply that I had to swallow twice before I could produce a single word. "Sophie," I managed at last, "this is the most beautiful thing I have seen all year." Her face lit up the way a lamp lights a room when someone throws the switch. "I drew it because I never want you to move, Grandpa. I want you to stay here forever." The words reached me somewhere so deep I felt them in the soles of my feet. I crouched down to her level, both knees protesting the way they always do now. And I held the drawing carefully with both hands and looked at it for a long moment. The yellow house, the apple tree, the small gray-haired figure standing quietly on the porch. And I thought, this is what we are actually talking about. Not a property transfer agreement. Not a 60-day close. Not signatures on paper in a lawyer's office. This house. This child. This drawing held in 2 hands by a little girl who doesn't want her grandfather to disappear. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," I said, and my voice was rock steady because I meant every syllable of it all the way down. "I promise you that." When they left that afternoon, Greg shook my hand at the door. Firm, warm, the confident handshake of a man who believes the hard work is already done and the outcome is already settled. Diane kissed my cheek. Sophie hugged me hard enough to rock me back a half step, and I held on until she began to giggle and squirm away toward the truck. I stood in the doorway and watched them back out of the driveway and turn left onto Birchwood Lane and disappear around the corner. I stood there until there was nothing left to watch. Then I went inside, closed the door quietly behind me, and washed every dish from the meal. I dried them one by one with the dish towel and put them back in Carol's cabinet in exactly the right places, the places they had always lived. I folded the dish towel over the oven handle the way Carol always did, lengthwise first, then folded into thirds, hanging even on both sides. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the quiet of the house, in the particular silence that comes after people have left and the rooms are settling back into themselves. Sophie's drawing was propped against the fruit bowl on the counter where I had placed it. The yellow house, the apple tree, the little figure on the porch. 1 week, 7 days. I had held this together for 173 days, through every Sunday lunch and every warm handshake and every careful, searching visit that was never quite what it claimed to be. I had smiled at the right moments and said the right things, and given nothing away that I wasn't ready to give. I had watched and waited and learned and prepared, one quiet day at a time. 7 more days was nothing at all. I turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hall to the study, sat down at the desk that had been mine for 30 years, and got back to work. Before I reveal exactly how I exposed them in front of everyone they know, comment "still here" or type 114 in the comments right now so I know you're writing this out with me. And please note, the following part contains some fictionalized developments and may not be completely factual. If you prefer not to listen further, you are welcome to turn off the video right here. April 12th arrived clear and perfectly still, the kind of Iowa spring afternoon that comes without warning and makes the whole county feel as though it has remembered after a long and difficult winter how to breathe again. By 3 o'clock, my backyard held 38 people beneath a canopy of string lights that had not yet begun to glow in the brightness of the afternoon. A table near the fence was crowded with pink balloons Sophie had chosen herself, and at the center of it all stood a birthday cake from the bakery on 5th Street. 9 unlit candles pressed into the frosting in a careful row. Sophie was everywhere at once, the way only 9-year-olds can be, running between clusters of school friends, pulling her cousin by the hand toward the rose beds, throwing her head back with laughter at something happening near the apple tree. 9 years old and completely gloriously untouched by everything that had been circling this house for the past 7 months. Watching her move through the afternoon light, I felt something loosen inside my chest that had been pulled tight for so long I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. I moved through the party the same way I had moved through every Sunday lunch for 4 months. Slightly vague, slightly unhurried, the amiable grandfather who needed to be spoken to with patience and care. I accepted a glass of lemonade. I asked Sophie's friend's mother how the drive-in had been. I let Greg refill my plate with a warm, familiar hand on my shoulder and a smile that had not changed since October, the smile of a man who believes the ground beneath his feet is solid. It was Diane who gave me the moment. She was standing near the back fence with Greg's aunt, a woman named Roberta who had driven up from Des Moines and whom I had always genuinely liked, and her voice carried across the patio with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who has not stopped to check who might be within earshot. "Dad's been a little confused lately," she said, her tone wrapped in the warm performance of concern. "We're going to need to start handling things for him. It's really for the best. He just can't be trusted with the details anymore." Roberta murmured something low and sympathetic in response. I set my lemonade glass down on the table beside me. Slowly, deliberately. The way you set something down when you want both hands completely free for whatever comes next. "Diane," I said, and my voice carried without any effort at all across the quiet patio. "What details would those be, exactly?" The conversations around us stuttered and fell away. Heads turned. Diane looked at me and her expression moved through 3 entirely different things in the space of 2 seconds. Genuine surprise, rapid internal recalibration, and then the smooth, practiced settling of someone returning to a position they had prepared for. She recovered quickly. she always had. "Oh, Dad, nothing serious. I was just telling Roberta. I'd like everyone to hear this," I said. I turned and walked into the house. Behind me, the party went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when something real and irreversible is about to happen. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of people who have understood all at once that the occasion they arrived for has become something else entirely. The laptop was on the coffee table, where I had left it that morning, already connected to the television by an HDMI cable. I had tested 3 separate times the night before. I had kept it closed and pushed to the far end of the table all afternoon, just another object in the room, to anyone who was not looking for it specifically. I opened it now, pressed play on the first file, and walked back to the patio doorway so I could see both the television screen through the glass and the faces of the people standing in my backyard at the same time. The living room screen filled with footage from October. The side entrance camera. The timestamp burning clear and steady in the upper corner. 2 figures moving through the dark hallway by the thin beam of a phone flashlight, unhurried, systematic. My home office door opening. The careful, methodical sounds of file drawers being pulled, and the quiet click of a camera shutter. Several people had already drifted toward the door. Greg had gone very still near the drinks table, his hand wrapped around a bottle he had stopped pouring, from his eyes fixed on the screen. Diane was still standing near the fence where I had left her, and the color had left her face entirely the kind of pallor that no performance, however practiced, can replicate. I let the October footage run for 45 seconds. Then I switched to the kitchen recording. Greg's voice came through the television speaker, calm and unhurried and perfectly clear. The more his hands shake, the easier this gets. Diane's voice steady and certain in the dark. "Give it a few more months. Nobody's going to take his word over the paperwork." Someone in the backyard made a sharp, involuntary sound. Not quite a gasp, something more instinctive than that something the body produces before the mind has finished processing what it has just heard. Roberta had both hands pressed hard against her mouth, her eyes wide above them. I switched to the March footage. Frank DeLuca tape measure in hand, moving through my master bedroom, with Greg narrating behind him in the easy, comfortable voice of a man showing a property he already considers his own. The image of a stranger measuring the doorframe of the room where Carol had died, where I still kept her reading glasses on the nightstand, because I had never been able to bring myself to put them away somewhere I couldn't see them. And then last, the February recording. 2:14 in the morning. My daughter's voice in the darkness of the kitchen, soft and certain, and absolutely convinced it was not being heard. "Mom's gone. This house was always going to be mine anyway." The backyard was so completely silent, I could hear the string lights humming in the still afternoon air above us. I closed the laptop. "Every account was changed 3 months ago," I said, looking at Diane directly across the yard, keeping my voice as level as I had kept it through 7 months of the most sustained and exhausting performance of my life. Every authorization has been revoked. Every document has been reviewed by people I trust. This house will not be transferred. Not in 60 days, not on any timeline, not ever. I crossed the patio to where she was standing. Her eyes were bright with something that could have been tears or could have been fury, I could not tell, and it did not change anything either way. "I need the house key back," I said quietly. "Please." Her hand was trembling as she unclipped it from her key ring. She placed it in my open palm without a single word, because there were no words available for this moment, and she knew it as well as I did. Greg set the bottle down on the drinks table, with a careful, deliberate motion, took Diane by the arm, and walked her toward the side gate without looking at anyone. Neither of them looked back. As Diane rose from where she had been standing, her glass tipped from the edge of the table and fell shattering against the patio stones, with a sharp, clean sound that rang out across the silent yard like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I looked down at the broken glass on the stones. Then I looked up. Sophie was standing near the birthday table, with her hands clasped in front of her, perfectly still in a way that 9-year-olds almost never are. Her eyes moving slowly between me and the side gate where her parents had just disappeared. Her face held the careful, searching expression of a child who knows something important has happened and is waiting to understand how she is supposed to feel about it. I walked to her. I crouched down, both knees aching with the familiar protest they always made, until my eyes were level with hers. "Hey, sweetheart." I kept my voice soft and even. "The party isn't over yet. Do you want to blow out your candles?" Her chin trembled just once, just briefly, the way a flame trembles in a sudden draft before it steadies itself. Then she gave a small, decisive nod. I straightened up, struck a match, and lit all 9 candles one by one. The small flames stood perfectly upright and still in the calm April air, burning without flickering, as though the afternoon itself had decided to hold its breath for her. Around us, slowly and carefully, as though testing whether the ground would hold, people began to move again. Someone started singing. Others joined in one voice at a time until the song filled the backyard, the way warmth fills a room. Sophie leaned forward over the cake with her eyes closed for just a moment, making her wish, keeping it private the way children do, and then she blew with everything she had. All 9 candles went out at once. 2 weeks after Sophie's birthday, on a Tuesday morning, when the temperature had finally climbed above 50 and the forsythia along the back fence was starting to show yellow. I drove to the post office and mailed the envelope. I had been holding it since March. Not out of hesitation, I knew what it contained and I knew what it would do. I held it because I wanted to be sure I was sending it for the right reasons. The HR director at Meridian Project Solutions, Greg's 11-year employer, was going to receive a USB drive and David's 2-page summary on firm letterhead. Factual, precise, no editorializing, just the footage the bank records, the power of attorney, and a clear dated timeline of events from October through April. Everything that had happened in the order it had happened, laid out the way a contractor lays out materials before a job, nothing missing, nothing extra. I didn't mail it the night of the party. I went home after the last guest left, swept the broken glass off the patio stones, and sat in Carol's chair until 11 o'clock without turning on a single light. I wasn't numb exactly. More like emptied out, the way you feel after something you've been bracing for finally arrives, and the bracing is suddenly no longer necessary. I waited 2 weeks because I wanted to be certain I wasn't acting out of anger. Every morning I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope beside my coffee cup and asked myself the same question. Is this justice or is this revenge, and can I honestly tell the difference? By the 14th morning, I had my answer. It was neither. It was consequence. Greg had made choices over many months, careful, calculated choices, and those choices had produced evidence. The evidence existed whether I mailed anything or not. All I was doing was making sure it reached the people who had the right to know. His employer, his bonding insurer, the people whose trust he'd been trading on for 11 years while quietly building a plan to take a 65-year-old widower's home out from under him. Actions produce consequences, the way spring follows winter in Iowa, not as punishment, not as reward, just as the next thing that happens. I dropped the envelope in the slot and drove home. 3 days later, David called. "Meridian terminated Greg this morning," he said. "Effective immediately. His position required financial bonding. The company's bonding insurer pulled coverage the moment they reviewed the documentation. Without the bond, he can't work in construction management. Not in Iowa, and not in any state that shares bonding registry data." I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside the window, a robin was working the edge of Carol's garden bed with focused efficiency. "Spring business, life proceeding. And DeLuca?" I asked. Frank DeLuca withdrew his offer on the property the same day the party footage started circulating among people who'd been there. Word travels fast in a town this size. David paused. He's not going to touch anything connected to Greg Mercer. The civil judgments against him in Illinois already put him close to the line. He's not willing to risk a criminal exposure in Iowa on top of that. Good, I said. David paused again. Ray, I want to ask you something directly. Do you want to pursue criminal charges? Elder financial exploitation is a Class D felony in Iowa. With what we have, the unauthorized entries, the bank withdrawals, the fraudulent POA, the DeLuca footage, a county prosecutor would have a legitimate case. I looked at Sophie's crayon drawing still propped against the fruit bowl, the yellow walls, the apple tree, the little gray-haired figure on the front porch. No, I said. Not right now. Sophie's 9 years old. I am not putting her parents in a criminal proceeding on her birthday month. The consequences that have already arrived are real and significant. I reserve the right to change my mind. That's entirely your prerogative, David said. The statute of limitations on a Class D felony in Iowa is 3 years. You have time. Then I'll keep the time, I said. Thank you, David, for all of it. After we hung up, I sat without moving for a while. $37,000 in small, careful withdrawals stopped. A forged power of attorney, legally void, existing now only as evidence against the person who'd prepared it. A 60-day close that would never happen. An entire methodology built on the assumption that a man my age with a tremor in his right hand was already too far gone to notice. All of it stopped. All of it documented. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. I had anticipated feeling something large relief maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a completed transaction. What I felt instead was mostly tired, and beneath the tired, something I can only describe as a slow, careful return to myself. The way circulation comes back to a limb that has been compressed too long, not all at once, but steadily. Without Greg's income, and with the house plan collapsed entirely, the financial pressure on Diane and Greg came down fast and hard. Diane had her part-time work, but the mortgage on their Briarwood house, 2 car payments, and Sophie's school tuition had all been structured around 2 full salaries. Greg started picking up consulting work. Most of it didn't pan out. By summer, they were 3 months behind on the mortgage. By August, they were arguing in the way couples argue when they've run out of anything to argue about except each other. Diane called me once in July on a Sunday evening. I held the phone through 2 rings before I answered. Dad? Her voice was stripped of everything I'd grown used to, none of the practiced brightness, none of the careful management. Just tired. Just her. I don't know what to say to you. Then don't say anything yet, I told her. Take care of Sophie. That's the only thing that matters right now. She was crying by the time she said goodbye, quiet, exhausted, crying that had no performance left in it. I held the phone long after the call ended and sat with the complicated weight of loving someone who had chosen what she chose. I had loved her since the morning she was born, and I still did. And I didn't know what to do with that love now, except hold it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that has already been damaged, and wait. Some things aren't meant to resolve quickly. Some things take longer than a season. Greg and Diane separated in September. The divorce was filed in October in Lynn County District Court. Sophie still came to see me. Diane made sure of that. Whatever else had fractured between us, she kept that piece intact, and I was grateful for it in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Every other Saturday, Sophie would arrive at the back gate at a full run, arms out, hitting me at the waist, with enough force to make me grab the doorframe. Every time. The same force. I always held on a full second longer than necessary. The roses Carol planted came back that spring the way they always did, full and red and completely indifferent to everything that had happened around them. One evening in late October, I stood on the back patio in the last of the daylight and looked at the camera mounted on the eave above the side entrance, the same camera Greg had positioned himself that Saturday morning, nearly a year before, when he'd spent extra time on the angle, and I'd told myself it was because he'd watched 6 hours of tutorials. $37,000 in small withdrawals stopped. A forged power of attorney rendered useless. A 60-day close that would never happen. A plan built on the assumption that an old man with shaking hands was too far gone to notice anything at all. All of it undone by a camera that Greg Mercer had insisted on installing, paid for with his own money. Positioned with his own 2 hands, in a house he was certain he was about to own. "You would have found that funny," I said out loud to Carol, to the rosebeds, to the particular quality of late October light that had always been her favorite time of year. "You always said the truth had a way of coming out through whatever door was left open." She was right, the way she was usually right, about the things that mattered. I went inside, locked the door, and made myself a cup of tea in a kitchen that was still mine, in a house that was still mine, in a life that battered and altered and lonelier than I would have chosen, was still completely and without question still mine. People ask me sometimes what I learned from all of this. Here is what I learned: trust is not weakness, but trust without discernment is a door you leave unlocked and then wonder how a stranger got inside. I trusted too fast, too completely, and for too long, and I tell you that not to earn your sympathy, but because I hope you'll do differently. Don't wait for the footage. Don't wait for the numbers that don't add up. Look closely at the people who are most eager to take things off your hands. Family stories. Revenge rarely begin with a villain. They begin with someone who loves you just enough to believe they deserve what you have. I am not a bitter man. God has a way of returning what belongs to you, sometimes quietly, sometimes through a camera your son-in-law installed with his own hands. That is not irony. That is justice wearing patience like a coat. If my story sounds like your story, check your documents. Read what you sign, and remember, the people who want to manage your life are not always the people who want to protect it. This has been one of the family drama revenge stories that remind us dignity is worth defending at any age, in any season. Every family drama revenge story carries a warning, and this one is no different. If this family drama revenge moved you deeply, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. Disclaimer: upcoming stories contain fictional elements created for educational purposes. If this content isn't for you, feel free to explore other channels, and we wish you well wherever you land.